The ridge dropped away into a basin of absolute stillness. Daniel, Maya, and Adam stood at the edge, their boots crunching on loose gravel, but the sound died instantly in the heavy air. Below them, a village sat nestled in the valley floor. It was not on any map. It existed in a perfect circle, with houses and shops spiraling toward a central clock tower that dominated the landscape. Nothing moved. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No birds circled the rooftops. The air felt thick, like water trapped in a stagnant pool. Resisting every breath they took, Daniel stepped forward, his eyes locked on the geometry of the streets. The layout was too precise, too calculated to be natural. Maya leaned over the edge, squinting against the glare of the morning sun, but she saw no roads leading in or out of the basin. The village was a self-contained island of stone and wood, isolated from the rest of the world. Adam gripped his camera, his knuckles white, but he did not lift the lens. The silence was not just an absence of noise. It was an active force that pressed against their eardrums. They stood on the precipice for a long moment, caught between the urge to turn back and the magnetic pull of the impossible scene below. Then, Daniel took the first step down the slope. They reached the center of the square, where the shadow of the clock tower stretched long across the cobblestones. Daniel flicked his wrist, checking his watch. 8:15 a.m. The sun hung high, but the tower clock displayed 11:47 p.m. The discrepancy hit him like a physical blow. He gestured for the others to look. Maya hurried to a nearby bakery, peering through the glass at a wall clock. It showed 3:02 a.m. Every device in the village hummed with a different, irregular pulse. There was no uniformity. A grandfather clock in a storefront ticked in a frantic, rapid-fire rhythm, while a small pocket watch dropped by a doorway barely moved at all. Adam raised his camera to document the phenomenon, but his hands shook so violently the lens rattled against the frame. He tried to focus, but the mechanical shutter refused to click in time with his intent. The soundscape was a nightmare of overlapping gears and mismatched strikes, a discordant metallic chorus that made the air vibrate. Daniel felt a wave of dizziness. He looked from his watch to the tower, then back to the bakery. The rhythm of the world was fracturing. Every tick was a contradiction, and the certainty of their own time was dissolving into the stagnant air of the village. They stood frozen, trapped in a place where seconds refused to align. The discordant ticking seemed to grow louder, echoing off the stone walls of the square. Daniel took a step back, his eyes darting between the tower and the bakery, looking for a pattern that did not exist. Maya gripped his arm, her knuckles pale. Adam stood behind them, his breath hitching in his throat as he scanned the empty storefronts. The village felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap at any moment. Then, motion flickered in the dark mouth of an alleyway. A shadow detached itself from the wall, moving with a speed that defied the heavy, stagnant air. Before Daniel could react, a small figure darted into the light and lunged. A young girl sprinted across the cobblestones, her movements sharp and precise. She slammed into Daniel, her fingers locking around his wrist with a grip that felt like frozen metal. The sudden impact forced him to stumble backward, nearly colliding with Maya. He tried to pull his arm away, but her hold was immovable. Her pulse seemed to beat against his skin with a frantic, unnatural rhythm. She did not look at the other two, her eyes fixed entirely on Daniel. The air between them went cold. The ticking of the village clock seemed to drop to a low, guttural thrum, waiting for her to speak. Daniel strained against the girl, but her fingers remained locked like iron bands around his wrist. She leaned forward, her face inches from his, eyes wide and unblinking. Her voice was not a shout, but a low, jagged hiss that scraped against the quiet. "You are late," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of a final judgment. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. He shook his arm, his voice tight. "Late for what? Who are you?" She did not acknowledge his question. Her gaze drifted past him, locking onto the central clock tower that loomed over the square. She raised a rigid finger, pointing directly at the silent, motionless clock face. "For tomorrow," she hissed again. The air in the square grew heavy, pressing against their chests as if the atmosphere itself had thickened. Maya stepped forward, her mouth opening to speak, but the girl's icy stare silenced her instantly. The girl's focus remained absolute, her body vibrating with a hidden, frantic energy. She pulled at Daniel's arm, not to drag him, but to force his eyes to follow hers to the tower. The deadline was no longer a theory. It was a physical presence, a weight descending upon them. The girl's grip tightened one last time, her nails biting into his skin, before she stared at the tower as if expecting the mechanism to shatter. The girl suddenly released her hold, her frame blurring as if viewed through heat haze. Before Daniel could regain his balance, the air behind them tore open. A brilliant, jagged flash of blue light ignited, washing the cobblestones in a harsh electric glare. Maya screamed, throwing her hands up to shield her eyes, while Adam stumbled back, his camera slipping from his nerveless fingers to clatter against the stone. Out of the blinding luminescence stepped a figure, his presence commanding the very air to vibrate. It was Zyron. He stood with his staff held high, the crystal tip glowing with a frantic, rhythmic pulse that mirrored the village's erratic clocks. His face was pale, stripped of all color, and his eyes darted across the square with the intensity of a man hunted. He did not waste time on greetings or pleasantries. He slammed the butt of his staff into the ground, a shockwave of force rippling outward. "Get inside, now!" he bellowed, his voice raw with a desperate, sharp urgency. He gestured toward a doorway nearby, his gaze locked on the perimeter of the square, as if expecting an invisible enemy to breach the light. The command shattered the lingering paralysis of the group. Daniel looked from the glowing staff to the looming tower, realizing that whatever threat Zyron feared was already closing in. Daniel planted his feet, refusing to be herded like a frightened animal. He caught Zyron by the arm, forcing the man to pause. "You recognize this place?" he demanded, his voice cracking under the pressure of the impossible. "Where are we?" Zyron shook off his grip, his gaze fixed on the horizon rather than the village around them. He did not look back. His voice was a flat, hollow monotone that barely carried over the wind. "This village does not exist in the present," Zyron muttered, his knuckles white against the wood of his staff. "We are standing in tomorrow." The words hung in the stagnant air, stripped of any comfort or logic. Maya let out a sharp, ragged breath, her hands drifting to her throat. Adam stared at his camera, his finger hovering over the shutter button. But he did not press it. The concept refused to take hold. Daniel looked at the clock tower, then at the empty, silent streets. The buildings appeared solid. The cobblestones felt real beneath his boots, but the foundation of his world had just dissolved. They were not trapped in a strange location. They were trapped in a time that had not yet occurred. The silence of the village took on a predatory quality, pressing in on them as the weight of the revelation settled into their bones. They were ghosts in the future. The heavy silence that had defined the village suddenly snapped. It began with a single, sharp click from the tower, followed immediately by a discordant cacophony that erupted from every corner of the basin. Thousands of clocks, hidden in shops, homes, and alleyways, chimed in perfect, violent unison. The sound was not musical. It was a metallic roar, a grinding screech of gears and springs that vibrated through the cobblestones and rattled the teeth in their skulls. Daniel doubled over, clapping his hands over his ears, but the noise pierced through his fingers. Maya sank to her knees, her eyes wide and unfocused, as the sheer volume threatened to overwhelm her senses. Around them, the village reacted instantly. The people walking the square stopped mid-stride, their heads snapped forward, their limbs locking into place with the rigid precision of clockwork. The rhythmic pulse of the chime grew louder, more aggressive, turning the air into a physical weight that pressed against their chests. Adam dropped his equipment, his body shaking under the sonic pressure. The world had become a deafening, mechanical trap, and the very foundation of the street seemed to moan in sympathy with the screeching iron. They were no longer observers, they were targets caught in the heart of a sonic storm. The sound faded into a low, resonant thrum, leaving the village transformed. The people in the square remained frozen, their skin hardening into a dull gray texture. They were no longer breathing. They were statues of flesh and bone, trapped in the exact moment the chime had ended. Daniel reached out, touching the shoulder of a man nearby. It felt like cold, polished marble. There was no pulse, no warmth, just the absolute stillness of a stopped machine. Before he could pull away, the sky above the valley lurched. The sun, previously hanging in a static position, suddenly shot across the horizon. It dipped below the western ridge and reappeared in the east within seconds, bathing the square in a strobe-like cycle of blinding light and deep shadow. Maya shielded her eyes, her breath catching as the day-night cycle accelerated into a violent, rhythmic blur. Adam stumbled back, his boots sliding on the shifting light patterns of the cobblestones. The sheer velocity of the sun's path defied all physics. They watched as the architecture around them seemed to vibrate, caught in the wake of a world spinning out of control. Fear took root, not from the statues, but from the realization that time itself was no longer a constant. They stood at the center of a collapsing reality, helpless against the rapid, predatory pulse of the sun.
The sun did not stop. It tore across the sky, a searing streak of gold that rose and set in a rhythmic 3-second loop. Each flash of sunlight hit the square like a physical blow, followed immediately by a plunge into absolute darkness.
The strobe effect turned the silent village into a disjointed sequence of still frames.
Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, but the light bled through his eyelids, bright and insistent. He opened them to see the buildings shifting.
In the brief pulses of light, the architecture appeared to stretch and contract,
the stone walls vibrating as if the village itself were trying to shake off the weight of time. Maya gripped the edge of a fountain, her knuckles white. She watched the shadows of the clock tower dance across the ground, swinging back and forth with impossible speed like the pendulum of a dying god. Adam backed toward the center of the square,
his arms outstretched to find balance. His movements were jerky, mirroring the erratic light. Every 3 seconds,
the world was reborn and then discarded. The constant transition from searing day to pitch black made it impossible to judge distance or depth. They were trapped in a visual stutter, watching the reality of their surroundings fracture under the pressure of a sun that refused to stay still. The village was breaking apart, one heartbeat of light at a time. The rhythm of the sun intensified until the light became a constant, blinding glare. Then, the sound changed. A deep, grinding groan rose from beneath the cobblestones, vibrating through the soles of their boots. It was not an earthquake. It was the sound of something solid being forcibly pulled apart. Daniel shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of tearing stone. A jagged line manifested in the center of the square, starting at the base of the clock tower and snaking rapidly toward them. It was a fissure, but it held no dirt or rock. It was a clean, black gash in the air itself. As the crack widened, the edges did not crumble. They frayed like burnt paper. Through the opening, they saw nothing. No sky, no ground, just an absolute, suffocating emptiness that defied the laws of space. The air in the square was pulled toward the hole, creating a sudden, violent wind that whipped hair and loose debris into the dark void. Maya stumbled, her hands clawing at the air as the gravity of the square began to tilt toward the rupture. They watched in frozen silence as the fabric of their world stretched and snapped, revealing that the village was not sitting on the earth, but suspended over a chasm of nothingness.
The black gash in the air settled, its edges glowing with a dying violet light. Through the rift,
the view changed from empty void to a nightmare of slow decay. A village, identical to the one they stood in, appeared, but it was dead. Rusted iron vines choked the clock tower, and the buildings were collapsed into jagged heaps of gray stone. Daniel peered into the ruin, his breath hitching as movement caught his eye. 4 figures stood amidst the wreckage. They were older, their skin mapped with deep, age-worn lines and their movements sluggish and heavy. Maya clutched her throat, staring at the woman standing near the fountain. It was herself, but the life had been drained from her eyes, replaced by a hollow, haunted gaze. Adam dropped his camera. It clattered against the cobblestones, the sound sharp and alien in the stagnant air. He recognized the man standing by the tower as his own reflection, decades older and broken by an unseen weight. These were not strangers. These were the ghosts of their own potential. The older Daniel raised a trembling hand, pointing directly at the present-day version. The gesture was not a greeting, it was a warning. The sight of their own ruined futures hit them with the force of a physical blow, turning their desire to investigate into an immediate, primal urge to turn and flee. The rift did not just exist, it hungered. The air in the square began to howl as it was sucked inward. A invisible current, pulling everything toward the jagged tear. Daniel gasped, his chest tightening as the atmosphere thinned. He clutched his throat, his mouth opening in a silent demand for oxygen that simply was not there. Beside him, Maya and Adam were dragged across the uneven stones, their boots scraping frantically for purchase. The vacuum was relentless. Stones, dust, and shattered wood were ripped from the ground and vanished into the darkness of the rift. Daniel reached for a stone pillar, his fingers slipping against the cold, smooth surface. The world tilted violently toward the void. Zyron lunged forward, his face strained with the effort of holding his ground against the gale. He slammed his staff into the cobblestones. A shock wave of blue light erupted from the impact point, spreading outward in a shimmering, translucent wall. The barrier crackled as it slammed against the vacuum pressure. It held, but the force of the suction bent the light into jagged, distorted shapes. They huddled behind the glow, lungs burning, the roar of the void vibrating through their very bones. The blue barrier hummed, vibrating under the relentless assault of the void. Cracks spiderwebbed across the shimmering surface, each pulse of light growing weaker. Zyron leaned his full weight into the staff, his knuckles white, but the suction was increasing. It was no longer just air being pulled. The very stability of the ground beneath them began to warp. A shadow detached itself from the swirling darkness within the rift. It was not a cloud of debris, but a hand gaunt, pale, and impossibly strong. It shot forward, passing through the barrier as if the light were nothing more than mist. The fingers locked onto Daniel's shoulder with a grip that sounded like snapping bone. Daniel shouted, but the sound was swallowed instantly by the roar of the vacuum. He clawed at the cobblestones, his fingernails leaving deep gouges in the rock, but the force was absolute. With a final, violent jerk, he was ripped from the earth. He tumbled backward, his body twisting as he crossed the threshold. In the blink of an eye, he was gone. The rift snapped shut for a fraction of a second, then surged with renewed fury. Maya lunged for the space where he had been, her fingers catching only empty, freezing air.
Adam stood frozen, his eyes wide, the silence of his own realization louder than the storm around them.
The rift shuddered, the blue light turning a sickly bruised violet. Maya held her breath,
her eyes locked on the tear in space. A silhouette flickered, then stumbled forward, collapsing onto the hard cobblestones.
It was Daniel, but the man who lay there was a stranger. His hair had turned the color of ash, and his skin was mapped with deep, jagged furrows that spoke of decades compressed into seconds. He gasped, a dry, rattling sound that tore through his chest. Maya took a step forward, her hand outstretched, but stopped when he looked up. His eyes were heavy, clouded with a weariness that defied human measure. He pushed himself upright,
his movements stiff and agonizingly slow. He looked toward the clock tower, then back at his companions.
"We have 6 minutes," he rasped, his voice a gravelly echo of the man they knew. He pointed toward the tower, where the mechanisms were now grinding in reverse, the iron gears screaming against each other.
"The village is collapsing. The time we have is all that remains." He stood on shaky legs,
his body trembling under the weight of his own accelerated life. The ground beneath them groaned, splitting into new, wider fissures. Time was running out, and the air grew thick with the scent of ozone and decaying iron. The ground buckled, sending a shockwave through the square that knocked Maya off balance. She lunged forward, catching herself on a stone pillar as the pavement ahead dissolved into jagged gravel. The tower stood ahead, its massive gears grinding with a metallic shriek that vibrated in their marrow. They ran. Each step was a gamble on shifting earth. Daniel led, his aged limbs moving with a frantic, desperate precision, weaving through the debris of falling roof tiles and splintering wood. A 3-story structure to their left groaned, its foundations snapping like dry bone. It tilted, then crashed downward, blocking their primary path. Adam skidded to a halt, dust clouding his vision, but Daniel was already veering right, scrambling over a pile of broken masonry. They surged forward, lungs burning, their eyes fixed on the small, unassuming black door nestled at the very base of the clock tower. The air grew thin, sucked into the widening fissures that now crisscrossed the entire basin. They reached the base just as the cobblestones behind them gave way to an empty, bottomless void. Daniel threw his weight against the black door, his palms slamming into the cold surface. It held for a heartbeat, then groaned and swung inward. They dove into the darkness as the world outside began to fold in on itself.
The door slammed shut, sealing out the roar of the collapsing world. They stood in a cavernous silence,
illuminated by a frantic, rhythmic pulse of amber light. Thousands of clocks lined the walls, stretching into an impossible distance.
Each face was not a dial of numbers, but a window into a human life. Daniel moved closer to a brass-rimmed frame. Inside, a wedding ceremony played in a perpetual loop, the laughter muted and thin.
Another pulsed with the sharp, jagged sobs of a funeral. Adam reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the glass.
He could feel the heat radiating from it, the warmth of a child's first step, the cold sting of a final goodbye.
He pulled his hand back, his face pale. "These are not machines," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They are not measuring time. They are draining it." The realization hit them with the weight of a physical blow. A wedding, a heartbeat, a life's worth of joy, all harvested like wheat in a field. Maya watched a clock flicker,
the memory within it dimming as the energy was siphoned away into the central core. The air inside the room was stale, thick with the residue of stolen moments. They were standing in the slaughterhouse of human experience, watching the essence of existence being methodically stripped away to feed the mechanism.
The shadows at the far end of the chamber detached themselves from the walls. A woman stepped into the amber light,
her presence silencing the rhythmic ticking of the thousands of clocks. She moved with a liquid, terrifying grace, tilting a golden hourglass that seemed to contain the weight of an entire galaxy.
Daniel stepped in front of Maya and Adam, his knuckles white as he gripped his staff. The woman stopped,
her gaze sweeping over them with the indifference of a storm. "I am the keeper of tomorrow," she announced,
her voice echoing not in the room, but directly inside their skulls. She gestured at the walls of stolen memories. "Humanity is a broken vessel. You destroy your future before it even arrives, poisoning the well of time with your greed and your wars."
She turned the hourglass over. Sand flowed upward, defying gravity.
"I have decided to remove the burden of the future entirely. I am pruning the rot from the tree of existence." The air in the room grew frigid, turning their breath into white mist. She looked at Daniel, her expression frozen in a mask of cold.
"Celestial judgment. The choice is no longer yours to make, yet here you are."
The final witnesses to your own obsolescence. The weight of the world's fate settled over them, heavy and suffocating. The keeper raised her hand, her fingers poised for a final, sharp movement. She snapped. The sound cracked through the chamber like a gunshot. Instantly, the walls of pulsing clocks began to fray at the edges, dissolving into black smoke. The floor vanished beneath their feet. Daniel lunged, catching Maya by the arm as they drifted into an infinite, hollow expanse. The amber light was swallowed by a vacuum of absolute darkness. There was no sound, no air, no sense of direction, only the terrifying sensation of falling through an endless, empty space. Adam shouted, but his voice died before it could travel. Then, a single,
piercing chime cut through the silence. A solitary clock appeared, suspended in the void, its face radiating a cold, clinical light. It was the only thing left in existence. Daniel blinked, his eyes straining to locate the others.
He felt Maya's hand press into his palm, then Adam's grip tightening on his shoulder.
They were anchored together in the nothingness. The clock ticked, a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat counting down to midnight.
Each movement of the hand felt like a tremor in the fabric of their reality.
They were no longer in a village or a room. They were at the end of all things, staring into the final second of their timeline. The clock face pulsed with a rhythm that matched their own frantic heartbeats. It was a gateway of shifting gears and blinding illumination, hung in the center of the nothingness. Daniel reached out,
his fingers trembling as he touched the cold, metallic surface. It vibrated, humming with the energy of every second ever lived.
Maya and Adam moved in lockstep, pressing their hands against his, forming a circle of intent against the encroaching void.
The surface of the clock began to crack, shedding light like molten silver. It fought them, pushing back with the weight of 1,000 forgotten tomorrows, but they did not pull away. They locked their gazes,
anchoring each other against the pressure of the impending erasure. The ticking grew louder,
accelerating into a singular, sustained roar that shook the very air they breathed. Daniel shouted a silent command to the clock,
his knuckles white against the glass. The gears inside screamed, spinning into a blur of gold and white. Then, the light reached a critical mass. It exploded outward, a silent, blinding wave that stripped away the darkness, the void, and the memory of the village. For an instant, there was only the sensation of falling upward, and then, the light claimed everything, washing the universe clean in a single, silent flash. The white light faded into a soft, golden haze. Daniel blinked, his vision clearing to reveal a vast, impossible landscape. They stood upon a platform of polished stone, suspended high above a sea of swirling clouds. Massive, intricate gears drifted through the sky like slow-moving moons, their teeth grinding with the low, rhythmic hum of a heartbeat. Maya took a step forward, her breath hitching as she looked out over the horizon. A city of translucent spires shimmered in the distance, anchored to nothing but the air itself. At the very edge of the platform, a colossal golden door stood upright, independent of any wall or frame. It hummed with an ancient, resonant power. Zyron knelt nearby, his head bowed, his hands pressed flat against the stone. "The beginning of time," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Daniel looked at Maya and Adam. Their faces were weathered by the journey, but their eyes held a new, steady focus. He reached out, grabbing their hands. The weight of the past had vanished, replaced by the crushing potential of the present. He looked up at the towering golden gate, its surface reflecting the endless possibilities of the dawn. "Tomorrow can wait," he said. Together, they took the first step forward, walking off the platform and into the impossible light of the gate.